Mr. President, members of the legislature, just so that some of the terms that we use are accurate, when a person is sentenced to die, he or she has an automatic appeal to the Nebraska Supreme Court based on the Constitution. Since we're dealing with the death penalty, I'll talk about that sentence. But when a person is convicted of any crime and exhausts his or her appeals, there is not another appeal. There is what is called post-conviction relief. That means you go back to the sentencing court and you raise issues that were not available to you at the time of your direct appeal. And that court will determine, based on your filing, whether there should be what they call an evidentiary hearing, where you actually present evidence for and against, and then a ruling is made. But it's not enough to just show that maybe a right of yours was violated. That right must rise to the level of a violation of the constitutional right that you might have. If any person is convicted of a crime and the punishment is serious, that person is going to do whatever he or she thinks is available under the law to mitigate that punishment. People on the floor of this legislature do that when we try to talk to each other to say, what can I do to cause you to lessen your opposition to this bill? So sometimes we become sanctimonious, self-righteous, and want to put ourselves in the position of the God that people claim to worship. Senator Fulton wants absolute guarantees that certain contingencies that are very tenuous will not happen. And that cannot be given. He's an engineer. He can set out a formula and say that if we construct a pillar according to these specifications, it will bear a certain amount of weight if that weight is placed in a certain relationship to this pillar. He can say that. The formula may work on paper, but when you build the pillar, there could be a defect in the material that is used, and that pillar will not support that weight. So even when he likes to talk about empirical evidence, even in his realm of engineering, there is nothing that is guaranteed to work the way that the formula says it should work. On paper, things are going to come out a certain way. Who in here can predict what any one of us is going to do at 12:01 p.m. today? Predict it right now. We don't know. When is Senator Fulton's foot or Achilles tendon going to be completely healed? He doesn't know, and the doctor doesn't know. But he is in that position where he wants some kind of ironclad guarantee that cannot be given with reference to any human conduct. Right now, if a sex offender is convicted, sentenced, serves all of his time, because of the possibility or probability that he may offend again, they can continue locking that person up. That is predicting the future. When a person is convicted of being a habitual criminal, that is based on the notion that this person has chosen a life of crime and is likely to continue it, because that final felony of which he or she is convicted does not carry a sentence as stiff as that of the habitual criminal statute. So you are punishing that person and holding him or her in the lockup based on what you think is likely to happen in the future. That's already done, and you know what prosecutors do? They use the threat of a habitual criminal charge to get somebody to plead guilty to a lesser offense. Well, if the person is really that dangerous, why should you plea bargain and let that person get a lesser offense if you've already concluded he or she is likely to offend again? There is so much hypocrisy in this system, and I wish our colleagues were better informed on the way the law works right now. Do you all know, and it had to be acknowledged under questioning by me to some prosecutors, that there can be co-defendants, and the trigger puller can win the race to the prosecutor, turn state's evidence, and the co-defendant who did not pull the trigger can get the death penalty and the trigger man doesn't.
Time.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Aguilar. And I agree with what my colleagues just said. Members of the legislature, Senator Erdman talked about specifics. You all are not going to pay attention to specifics, and I know it. And I know the governor has people working to try to keep this bill from reaching his desk. That's where the politics are, Senator Erdman. The vast majority of first-degree murderers are not even made eligible for the death penalty based on the way the prosecutor proceeds with the case. Most of the time, there is a plea bargain. Now, if this person is deemed to be dangerous, why? The plea bargain to let that person be in the general population and not on death row. Even Senator Flood has not paid attention to the realities. Senator Friend has not paid attention. The prosecutors before the Judiciary Committee responded to my questioning and acknowledged that there are people not on death row in Nebraska who've committed far worse murders than those who are on death row. The prosecutors admitted it. So where is this fear that Senator Fulton keeps talking about of the harm and the danger that these people pose? Senator Flood mentioned a guy named Dunster who sent some threatening stuff to me, but it made me no difference. That man was transferred here from Colorado, and the transfer should never have been accepted by Nebraska. But based on what he had done in Colorado, he should have been incarcerated differently from the way he was. In other words, he should not have had a cellmate. That was preventable. So that doesn't make their point. What you have to look at is the vast number of first-degree murderers who are out there in the prison population and haven't harmed a hair on anybody's head. And Senator Fulton had to scramble and scratch to find a case in California where somebody from a jail cell allegedly put a hit on somebody outside that jail cell.
1 minute.
He's not going to find that in Nebraska. That is an aberration. And to show you how skewed this system is, the worst murderers, if you want to say there's such a category, would be those who kill for murder, for money. Do you know what happens to the contract killers in this country? They are turned into snitches. They are put in the protection program and given a different identity. They don't go to the death house. The worst murderers always escape the noose, the gas, the electric chair. Those are the realities that Senator Erdman, Senator Flood, and others ignore, and that's going on in the real world right now and in Nebraska. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Shimmick. Senator Flood mentioned two cases in which the Nebraska Supreme Court made various comments. They were the cases of Rust and Holtan. He may not know, but both of those men left death row other than by way of execution. The vast majority of people who wound up on death row in Nebraska. This is for Senator Erdman, Senator Friend, and Senator Flood, who profess so much concern about specifics. The majority of those who wound up on death row in Nebraska left death row not by way of execution, nor by natural death. Some died. So why is that? Why aren't you all concerned about that? You don't even know about it because you don't care. Your side is the political side. Our side has to come up with the facts, and the facts are there. What Senator Friend needs to realize is that every law is philosophically based. There is no crime that exists in Nebraska unless the legislature says it is a crime. A crime exists when the legislature criminalizes certain conduct. And that criminalization occurs because of a philosophical process that is gone through, and a decision is made to say that if you engage in this conduct from this day forward, you're going to be punished by the state. All of them are philosophically based. As for Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica, I read more and forgot more than Senator Friend ever knew. I studied Thomas Aquinas for 4 years at Creighton. And this man, whom they say is so brilliant, believed in what was called spontaneous generation of life. You know why he believed in spontaneous generation? Because you could have a pile of garbage, then for no reason life sprang up, and he was giving a logical explanation. But he deviated from what his master teacher Aristotle had taught, that you ought to begin your inquiry with investigation of the natural phenomenon. Had he done that, he would have learned that flies lay eggs in garbage. Eggs hatch and produce maggots, and those maggots are what Thomas Aquinas saw and thought sprang up spontaneously because he didn't know, and he could have found out if he had observed. Much of that flawed thinking occurs on the floor of this legislature. Senator Friend asked, will this bill fix the death penalty if it's broken? Nothing can fix it, Senator Friend. The U.S. Supreme Court approved of attempts by states to fix it when they put in place aggravating and mitigating circumstances. Furman versus Georgia struck down all death penalty laws, not because they said the death penalty itself violated the Constitution, but the way it was applied. There was nothing that guided the discretion of the jury or the judge, whoever was setting the penalty. And that allowed for too much arbitrariness, capriciousness, and discrimination. And most of that discrimination went toward minority groups, the poor, and the unpopular. If you read Supreme Court decisions for yourself, instead of going by these anecdotes which are nonsensical, you'd understand what we're talking about. But you don't care enough to do that. So when these aggravators and mitigators came into being, and Nebraska adopted some, Nebraska had to change, the Supreme Court had to change through interpretation those aggravators adopted by the legislature because they were too vague and violated the Constitution. So even though the Supreme Court upheld aggravators and mitigators, they did not fix it. And the Supreme Court of Nebraska had to rule that one of its proceedings it used in a death penalty case to reconsider evidence, and I'm simplifying it, violated the Constitution. So the Nebraska Supreme Court had to admit that itself had engaged in an interpretation and a process that was unconstitutional. The court can do it, and you're going to ask Senator Ashford or anybody else to tell how a court is going to rule on any law that we pass. That is preposterous. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you. Mr. President, members of the legislature, I'm going to touch on a few things that have been said by others. Senator Harms wondered why the system wouldn't be fixed. Senator Harms, I've brought more legislation than anybody to fix the system. And I can point out the statutory changes, not just with reference to the death penalty. But there was a time when the giving of radar tickets was very random, very carelessly done. So I got legislation to address that issue. And it has not really corrected the matter, because you have human beings carrying out the requirements of the law, as was pointed out by Senator Lathrop. Senator Loudon asked about the victims. We're not here talking about the victims. Executions are not carried out to benefit victims. The crime is committed against the state. That's why it's the state versus so-and-so. And to bring the victims in during a discussion like this is a diversionary matter, because the ones who talk about doing something for victims in this context do not show compassion for people in any other set of circumstances. So that, to my way of thinking, is a cheap attack against the bill. Killing in prison, where you got 211 first-degree murderers there right now, and they're not going around killing everybody. But because the discussion has gone on a while, and I think people's thinking has gotten fuzzy, and their comments have, there can be no mandatory death penalty in America. The legislature cannot say, if a person kills an individual in prison, the death penalty is the punishment. No. If the legislature put that on the books, that would be struck down as unconstitutional. You cannot have a mandatory death penalty in this state country for anything. The Supreme Court has said you have to look at the specifics of the offense, you have to look at the specific characteristics of the individual, and that's why you have this weighing of aggravating and mitigating circumstances. You still have to do that. Maybe somebody who committed a murder wound up in a prison because he or she didn't get the death penalty, and that person kills a person in prison. One of the mitigators is to have mental illness. The person maybe shouldn't have been in prison in the first place, but be given treatment. But because of the vengefulness, the desire for retribution, mentally ill people are in the penitentiary. So when that person commits the murder and comes up for a trial, and let's say that the prosecutor decides to go for the death penalty, which most of them are not going to do, and that's something that Senator Flood, Senator Friend, Senator Erdman don't want to deal with. They just gloss right over that, but they pretend to be so concerned. The mitigator is mental illness. You can't execute somebody who's mentally retarded, but there's a difference between mental retardation, which is immutable, and mental illness. That mental illness can be shown to have had such a role to play in this murder that that person is not going to get the death penalty even though the murder was committed in prison. You all cannot focus long enough to continue dealing with this issue based on what the law is in the statutes, the requirements under the Constitution as handed down by the Nebraska Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court. So to say that somebody committed a murder or 2 murders in prison means he or she will get the death penalty is false. That won't happen even now. So all these bogus arguments, people ought to just stand up and say, I want the death penalty no matter what you do, and stop bringing up these bogus arguments because that's what they are. But who other than me is going to take the time, maintain my focus, not get empty, not get tired, but continue to battle after we've been at it 12 hours like I would after we'd been at it for 12 minutes. Did you say time?
1 minute.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. Maybe I can touch on 1 or 2 other things. Senator Erdman can see that there are 10 people on death row and 211 who are not. What about when we were talking about banning cell phones? He didn't want to go after just the young people. He didn't think you should single them out. Treat everybody the same way who are doing the same thing. That was my position. And I said if it's the cell phone that's the problem, get the adults the same way. He was just interested in the young people. My principles go across the board. His don't. He doesn't want the young people mistreated. But if others are, it's all right. It's not all right with me if anybody is singled out for unfair treatment. And it's been a long, long time since I could be qualified as young, and all of my children are well grown. I have grandchildren.
Time.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Senator Shimmick. Senator Lathrop did a masterful job. I said when I stood up that I am opposed to the death penalty in every case, under all circumstances, regardless of who the victim is, regardless of who the perpetrator is, regardless of the circumstances. I pointed out that I had engineered legislation through this body which said that the mentally retarded cannot be executed, minors cannot be executed. I've said in the past that if I were like a hippopotamus and could swallow the death penalty in one gulp like a hippopotamus can swallow a bucket of fruit in one gulp, I'd do it. But since I can't even swallow an apple whole in one gulp, I do it by nibbling away incrementally. This is only an incremental step in narrowing the universe of people who will be subject to the death penalty. I would never bring a bill like this or to attach my name to a bill like this, which acknowledges that it is valid under some circumstances for the state to kill anybody. I would never do that. But I'll vote for a bill which is before us that narrows the reach of the death penalty. However it does it, I will support that. but I would not bring a bill that compromised that principle. To touch on something that Senator Nelson continues to bring up, and that's the issue of abortion. He views it from the standpoint of the zygote, the fetus, or the embryo. So he is an absolutist. He thinks that when an egg is fertilized, that's a full human being, and I don't. Just like I don't think an acorn is an oak tree. I don't think a fertilized chicken egg is a chicken. I don't go in a restaurant and say I want scrambled chicken. It's an egg, and we know the difference. But if somebody's religious belief brings them to the place where Senator Nelson is, Senator Carlson, that's his belief. And when we're debating an abortion issue, I say you can say all you want to, that abortion is a sin. That's your belief. But you will never get me to vote that it's a crime. Ever. Because I look at it from the standpoint of the woman. And I venture to say that we wouldn't have so many anti-abortion bills brought by men if men were to carry a fetus 9 months. Or could have been raped and impregnated. And that man would say, this that's in me, I got to carry it to term and I want to. Or let somebody force him to. See, it's easy for us to do like those Pharisees. They bind heavy burdens, grievous to be borne, lay them on other men's shoulders, and will not touch them with one of their fingers. Now, when it comes to Senator Carlson, I acknowledge for him, and as I did with Senator Foley and others, their belief is their belief, and I wouldn't try to move them from it. But on this floor, where we're talking about legislation, not salvation, I will not vote with them on that issue. But let that child come into the world, Senator Carlson, and let somebody take the life of what I believe to be a full-fledged human being, and you'll see something different from what you see and hear when I talk about the right of a woman to decide whether or not she's going to carry a pregnancy to term. That's between her and her doctor, and if she's religious, between her and her God. That's why I will always vote for a woman's right to determine whether to carry a pregnancy to term, while at the same time fighting strenuously, unwaveringly against the death penalty. There's a myth in the Bible about Samson, who as long as he had his hair and did not tell the secret, he was strong. But he let Delilah insinuate herself into his mind with her charms, and he said, if you cut my hair, I'm through. Senator Fulton got a haircut, and now he's lost his ability to reason. When he had some hair, then that hair kept those brains and those proper thoughts inside his head. Now that he got that skin-up haircut, everything has left him. But we're going to bring him back home before it's over. Thank you, Mr. President. Aguilar, thank you, Mr. President. And that study had to have some modifications made in it, and the man who made it had gone away on a trip to the South Seas, so the governor, the then governor and attorney general represented, they said, what it meant when they read an executive summary. So that study has been misused by a lot of people. But the Nebraska Supreme Court has a committee, I don't know if they call it the Committee on Diversity or what, but they've been studying the system for years. And Senator Peirce may not know this, but they found out that there's racial discrimination in the charging, in the sentencing, and in the courtroom treatment. Now, while he was prosecuting, he probably didn't notice any of these things. But this, you can get this from the Nebraska Supreme Court. Go ask the court administrator for some of the studies they've done, and it deals directly with Nebraska. But there's something I want to get across to my colleagues who may believe Senator Carlson and may not. If I were a Roman senator, Jesus may not have ever been executed. They'd have come to me. They say, Senator, we got this little Jewish fellow out there and nobody likes him. The religious people say, kill him. I say, well, what for? Well, he said things that they don't like. I say, so what? Well, that's a capital offense. I said, what are you asking me? They say, what should we do with him? I say, turn him loose. That's what you ought to do with him. But see, you didn't have a senator like me in the Roman Senate. So an innocent man was executed, as innocent men have been executed in America. And Senator Carlson, I do think a person's attitude on the death penalty says something about what he or she is, because they know that innocent people have been executed. And if you can be comfortable with the state killing innocent people, your morals don't exist. Everything you say is suspect, everything you say is flawed, and everything is political. And some of you on this floor told me why you couldn't vote against the death penalty, and it had nothing to do with morality. It had to do with what your constituents would say. They ought to be here instead of you. You are supposed to set the standard. You are supposed to be the one who is the teacher, who is the uplifter, the ennobler of society. But like a lapdog, you run behind slobbering and going where the ones who are uninformed tell you you better go. We all decide what we're going to do, and you've chosen one path, I've chosen another. But I'm going to make judgments on you all on the basis of what you say your moral principles are, not mine, but on the basis of what you claim to believe. Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Shimmick, members of the legislature, all these lawyers, and all of these righteous people, you're not listening to anything. Senator Whiteman's not listening to anything. Senator Harms, who doesn't like to hear us say that we ought to approach this this way instead of correcting everything else. Senator Flood's not listening. Senator Friend definitely is not listening. Let me tell you why. And why what you all say to me goes in one ear and out the other. You can say it's because my head is empty, whatever you want to, but that's what it amounts to. The majority of people sentenced to death row in Nebraska, Senator Harms, were found to have been sentenced contrary to the law and the Constitution, and the majority were taken off death row. Senator Erdman's not hearing that. Senator Friend's not hearing it. Senator Flood's not hearing it. You know why? Because there's something other than doing the right thing that's motivating them. Something happened in their district. It's as simple as that. And when Senator Flood has to answer a question by reading what somebody in a treatise said about retribution, it's clear it can't be his conviction. I don't have to read what somebody else said to tell you what my conviction is. But again, I live my life according to different standards from those of the people on the floor of the legislature, so I don't expect you to do like I do. I expect you to be utilitarians. I expect you to do what is convenient, what is easy, what is politically acceptable. But there was a guy named Ralph Waldo Emerson. I don't know what he believed or didn't believe, but he said, God does not make his works manifest through cowards. That's what Ralph Waldo Emerson, a white man, said, writing to and about other white people. God does not make his works manifest through cowards. So why do y'all pray here every morning? I bring it up because y'all do. And it ought to mean something to you. You'd have been right there with them when they said, Jesus is there and Barabbas is there. Which one should I let go? And when the crowd said, the religious leader said, release unto us Barabbas. So the crowd said, Barabbas. So they say, Senator Friend, who should we release? Barabbas? Senator Erdman, who should we release? Barabbas? And right down the line. I've watched you all on other issues, and I've listened to you. I've listened to you. And some of you have talked to me directly. You ought to wish that I'd be the one on Judgment Day, because as bad as some of you are and as weak as some of you are, not one of you would go to hell. I couldn't do that. I'm not righteous enough to send somebody to hell. I'm not godly enough to send somebody to hell and burn forever. Now, this might shock some of you. I don't even think Hitler should have suffered the death penalty if they caught him. I don't think Adolf Eichmann should have been hanged by the Jews. I don't think the man who shot Martin Luther King should have been executed, and he wasn't. James Earl Ray died in prison. I don't think anybody ought to be killed by the state. Not anybody. My principles are not based on religion. So, Senator Carlson, they're not elastic, where today I stretch them to take in something that's convenient, then I contract them tomorrow so that they leave out that which would be inconvenient for me to have to stand up for. Whatever the consequences that go along with my views, whatever the consequences are, I bear them. And I'd rather 10 years from now look back on what I've said and the positions I've taken than some of the positions that my colleagues have taken measured against their own words and their own advocacy on other issues. I can look anybody in the eye. I don't have to hang my head. But then, Senator Carlson, I don't believe in all these things where I walk around with a heavy weight of guilt, because I don't have a heaven to send somebody to or hell to put them in, and I only have to do what I think is right. It just happens that what I think is right is that the state should not kill anybody. The state should lead and guide citizens to a higher level of civilization, refinement, and nobility. And maybe that's naive and foolish, but I think that's what the state should be doing with its policies. Thank you, Mr. President.
Record, Mr. Clerk.
23 ayes, 25 nays, Mr. President, on adoption of the committee amendments.
The committee amendments are not adopted.